Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we will continue with Christmas at Fairacre by Miss Reed, the story The Christmas Mouse. Chapter 3. Upstairs in the double bed, the two little girls pulled the clothes to their chins and continued their long conversation. A nightlight, secure in a saucer on the dressing table, sent great shadows bowing and bending across the sloping ceiling, for the room was crisscrossed with draughts on this wild night from the ill-fitting window and door. Sometimes the brave little flame bent in a sudden blow from the cold air, as a crocus does in a gust of wind, but always it righted itself, continuing to give out its comforting light to the young children. "Shall I tell you why I'm going to stay awake all night?" asked Jane. "Yes." "Promise to do what I tell you?" "Yes." "Promise faithfully? See my finger wet and dry, cross your heart, everything?" "Everything," agreed Frances equably. Her eyelids were beginning to droop already. Left alone, free from the vehemence of her sister, she would have fallen asleep within a minute. "Then eat your pillow," demanded Jane. Frances was hauled back roughly from the rocking sea of sleep. "You know I can't," she protested. "You promised," said Jane. "Well, I unpromised," declared Frances. "I can't eat a pillow, and anyway, what would Mum say? Then I shan't tell you what I was going to." "I don't care," replied Frances untruthfully. Jane, enraged by such lack of response and such wanton breaking of solemn vows, bounced over onto her side back to Frances. "It was about Father Christmas," she said hotly, "but I'm not telling you now." "He'll come," said Frances drowsily. This confidence annoyed Jane still further. "Maybe he won't then. Tom Williams says there isn't a Father Christmas. That's why I'm going to stay awake, to see. So there." Through the veils of sleep, which were fast enmeshing her, Frances pondered upon this new problem. Tom Williams was a big boy, 10 years old at least. What's more, he was a sort of cousin. He should know what he was talking about. Nevertheless, "Tom Williams doesn't always speak the truth," answered Frances. In some ways, she was a wiser child than her sister. Jane gave an impatient snort. "Besides," said Frances, following up her point, "our teacher said he'll come. She don't tell lies, nor Mum, nor Gran." These were powerful allies, and Jane was conscious that Frances had some support. "Grown-ups hang together," said Jane darkly. "Don't forget we saw 2 Father Christmases this afternoon in Caxley. What about that, then?" "They was men dressed up," replied Frances stolidly. "Only pretend Father Christmases. It don't mean there isn't a real one as'll come tonight." A huge yawn caught her unawares. "You stay awake if you want to," she murmured, turning her head into the delicious warmth of the uneaten pillow. "I'm going to sleep." Secure in her faith, she was asleep in 5 minutes. But Jane, full of doubts and resentful of her sister's serenity, threw her arms above her head and gripped the rails of the brass bedstead, grimly beginning her vigil. Tonight she would learn the truth. Downstairs, the two women assembled the last few presents that needed wrapping on the big table. They made a motley collection. There were 3 or 4 pieces of basket work made by Mary, who was neat with her fingers, and these she dyed doubtfully. "Can't see myself ever making a tidy parcel of these flower holders," she remarked. "Do you think just a Christmas tag tied on would be all right?" Mrs. Barry surveyed the hanging baskets thoughtfully. "Well, it always looks a bit slapdash, I feel, to hand over something unwrapped. Looked as though you can't be bothered." "I can't," said Mary laconically, "but I see your point. We'd make a proper pig's ear of the wrapping paper trying to cover those. You're right, my girl, just a tag." Mary sat down thankfully and drew the packet of tags toward her. The presents were destined for neighbors, and the tags seemed remarkably juvenile for the elderly couples who were going to receive the baskets. Father Christmas waved from a chimney pot, a gollywog danced a jig, 2 pixies bore a Christmas tree, and a cat carried a Christmas pudding. Only 2 tags measured up to Mary's requirements, a row of bells on one and a red candle on the other. Ah well, she told herself, someone must make do with the pixies or the cat, And when you came to think of it, the tags would be on the back of the fire this time tomorrow, so why worry? She wrote diligently. Outside, the wind still screamed, rattling the window and making the back door thump in its frame. The curtains stirred in the onslaught, and now and again a little puff of smoke came into the room from the log fire as the wind eddied round the chimney pot. Mrs. Barry looked up from the jar of honey she was wrapping. "I'll go see if the rain's blowing in under that door at the back." She went out, causing a draft that rustled the wrapping paper and blew 2 of Mary's tags to the floor. Mrs. Barry was gone for some minutes and returned red-faced from stooping. "A puddle a good yard wide," she puffed. "I've left that old towel stuffed up against the crack. We'll have to get a new sill put on that threshold, Mary. It's times like this we miss our menfolk." Mary nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Hot tears pricked her eyes, but she bent lower to her task so that her mother should not see them. How was it, she wondered, that she could keep calm and talk about her loss, quite in control of her feelings, for 9/10 of the time, and yet a chance remark like this one pierced her armor so cruelly. Poor Gran, if she only knew. Better, of course, that she did not. She would never forgive herself if she thought she had caused pain. Unaware of the turmoil in her daughter's mind, Mrs. Barry turned her attention to a round tin of shortbread. "'Pon my word," she remarked, "I never learn. After all these years, you'd think I'd know better than to pick a round tin instead of a square one. I'll let you tackle this, Mary. It's for Margaret and Mary Waters. They're good to us all through the years, taking messages and traipsing round with the parish magazine in all weathers." Mary reached across for the tin, then checked. The eyes of the 2 women met questioningly. Above the sound of the gale outside, they had heard the metallic clink of their letterbox. "I'll go," said Mary. An envelope lay on the damp mat. She opened the door, letting in a rush of wind and rain and a few sodden leaves. There was no one to be seen. But in the distance, Mary thought she could see the bobbing light of a flashlight. To shout would have been useless. To follow in her slippers, idiotic. She pushed the door shut against the onslaught and returned to the light with the envelope. "For you, Mum," she said, handing over the glistening packet. Mrs. Barry withdrew a Christmas card, bright with robins and frosted leaves, and 2 embroidered white handkerchiefs. "From Mrs. Burton," said Mrs. Barry wonderingly. "Now who'd have thought it? Never exchanged presents before, have we? What makes her do a thing like this, I wonder? And turning out, too, on such a night. Dear soul, she shouldn't have done it. She's little enough to spare as it is." "You did feed her cat and chickens for a while when she was away last summer," said Mary. "Perhaps that's why." "That's only acting neighborly," protested Mrs. Barry. "No call for her to spend money on us." "Given her pleasure, I don't doubt," answered Mary. "The thing is, do we give her something back, and if so, what?" It was a knotty problem. Their eyes ranged over the presents before them, already allotted. "We'll have to find something," said Mrs. Barry firmly. "What about that box of soap upstairs?" "People are funny about soap," said Mary. "Might think it's a hint, you know. She's none too fond of washing, nice old thing though she is." They racked their brains in silence. "Half a pound of tea?" suggested Mrs. Barry at last. "Looks like charity," replied Mary. "Well, I wouldn't say no to a nice packet of tea," said Mrs. Barry with spirit. "What about one of our new tea towels?" "Costs too much," said Mary. "She'd mind about that." "I give up then," said Mrs. Barry. "You think of something. I must say these last-minute surprises are all very fine, but they do put you to some thinking." She tied the final knot round the honey pot and rose to her feet again. "Talking of tea, what about a cup?" "Lovely," said Mary. "Shall I cut us a sandwich?" "Not for me, just a cup of tea." The old lady went out, and Mary could hear the clattering of cups and saucers and the welcome tinkle of teaspoons. Suddenly, she felt inexpressibly tired. She longed to put her head down among the litter on the table and fall asleep. Sometimes she thought Christmas was more trouble than it was worth. All the fuss and flurry, then an empty purse just as the January bills came in. If only she had her mother's outlook. She still truly loved Christmas. She truly celebrated the birth of that God who walked beside her every hour of the day. She truly loved her neighbor, even that dratted Mrs. Burton, who was innocently putting them to such trouble. Mrs. Barry returned with the round tin tray bearing the cups and saucers and the homely brown teapot clad in a knitted tea cozy. Her face had a triumphant smile. "I've thought of something. A bottle of my blackcurrant wine. How's that? She can use it for her cough if she don't like it for anything better. What say?" "Perfect," said Mary. In agreement at last, they sipped their tea thankfully. Still awake upstairs, Jane heard the clinking of china and the voices of her mother and grandmother. Beside her, Frances snored lightly, her pink mouth slightly ajar, her lashes making dark crescents against her rosy cheeks. Jane's vigil seemed lonelier and bleaker every minute. What's more, she was hungry, she discovered. The thought of the blue biscuit tin, no doubt standing by the teacups below, caused her stomach to rumble. Cautiously, she slid her skinny legs out of bed, took a swift glance at the 2 empty pillowcases draped expectantly, one on each end of the brass bed rail, and crept to the door. The wind was making so much noise that no one heard the latch click or the footsteps on the stairs. The child opened the bottom door, which led directly into the living room, and stood blinking in the light like a little owl caught in the sunshine. "Mercy me," gasped Mrs. Barry, putting down her cup with a clatter. "What a start you gave me, child." "Jane," cried her mother, "what on earth are you doing down here?" Her voice was unusually sharp. Surprised and startled, she could have shaken the child in her exasperation. "I'm hungry," whispered Jane, conscious of her unpopularity. "You had a good supper," said Mary shortly. "Time you was asleep." "Let her come by the fire for a minute," pleaded Mrs. Barry. "Shut that door, my dear. The draft fairly cuts through us. Want a cup of tea and a biscuit?" The child's face lit up. "Shall I fetch a cup?" "Not with those bare feet," said Mary. "I'll get your mug, and then you go straight back to bed as soon as you're finished. Your grand's too good to you." She hurried kitchenward, and the child sat on the rag rug, smiling at the flames licking the log. It was snug down here. It was always snug with Gran. She put a hand on the old lady's knee. "Mum's cross," she whispered. "She's tired, done a lot today, and you know you really should be abed, giving her a break." They always hang together, these grown-ups, thought Jane rebelliously, but she took the mug of weak tea gratefully and the top biscuit from the tin when it was offered, even though it was a rich tea and she knew they were ginger nuts further down. "Is Frances asleep?" asked Mary. "Yes, I couldn't get off." "You told me you didn't intend to," replied her mother, trying to see Father Christmas, silly girl, as though he'll come if you're awake. The sooner you're asleep, the sooner he'll come. Torn with doubts, the child looked swiftly up into her grandmother's face. It told her nothing. The familiar kind smile played around the lips. The eyes looked down at her as comfortingly as ever. "Your mother's right. Drink up your tea and then snuggle back into bed. I'll come and tuck you up this time." Jane tilted her mug, put the last fragment of biscuit into her mouth, and scrambled to her feet. "Whose presents are those?" she said, suddenly aware of the parcels on the table. "Not yours," said Mary. "Neighbors," said her grandmother in the same breath. "You shall take some round for us tomorrow, and I want you to carry a bottle of wine very carefully to Mrs. Burton. Can you do it, do you think?" The child nodded, hesitated before her mother, then kissed her warmly on the cheek. "You hussy," said Mary, but her voice was soft, and the child saw that she was forgiven. Content at last, she followed her grandmother's bulk up the narrow stairs. The flame of the nightlight was burning low in the little hollow of its wax. The shadows wavered about the room as the old woman and the child moved toward the bed. "Now, no staying awake, mind," whispered Gran in a voice that brooked no argument. "I don't know who's been stuffing your head with nonsense, but you can forget it. Get off to sleep like Frances there. You'll see Father Christmas has been as soon as you wake up." She kissed the child and tucked in the bedclothes tightly. Jane listened to her grandmother's footsteps descending the creaking stairs, sighed for her lost intentions, and fell, almost instantly, into a deep sleep. Chapter 4. "My, that was a lucky escape," said Mrs. Barry. "Good thing we haven't got out those pillowcases." 2 pillowcases, identical to those hanging limply upstairs, had been hidden behind the couch in the cottage parlor for the last 2 days. Most of the presents were already in them. A doll for each, beautifully dressed in hand-sewn clothes, joint presents from Mary and her mother, a game of Ludo for Frances and Snakes and Ladders for Jane, and a jigsaw puzzle apiece. All should provide plenty of future pleasure. The American aunt had sent 2 little cardigans, pale pink and edged with silver trimming, far more glamorous than anything to be found at the Caxley shops. The less well-off aunt at Taunton had sent bath salts for both, which Mary knew would enchant the little girls. There were also gifts from kind neighbors, a box of beads, a toy shop complete with tiny metal scales, and several tons of sweets, mint humbugs, and homemade toffee among them. A stocking, waiting to be filled with small knickknacks, lay across each pillowcase. As soon as the children were safely asleep, the plan had been to substitute the full pillowcases for the empty ones. "I thought she might reappear," admitted Mary. "She's twigged, you know, about Father Christmas. Some of the children at school have let it out." "She won't come down again, I'm certain," replied Mrs. Barry comfortingly. "Let's fill up the stockings, shall we? We can put the last-minute odds and ends in when we carry up the pillowcases." Mary nodded agreement and went to the parlor, returning with the limp stockings. They were a pair of red and white striped woolen ones, once the property of the vicar's aunt, and reputedly kept for skating and skiing in her young days. Mary had bought them at a jumble sale, and each Christmas since they had appeared to delight the little girls. From the dresser drawer, Mrs. Barry collected the store of small treasures that had been hidden there for the last week or so. A few wrapped sweets, a curly stick of barley sugar, a comb, a tiny pencil and pad, a brooch, and a handkerchief followed the tangerines that stuffed the toe of each stocking. Then, almost guiltily, Mrs. Barry produced the final touch: 2 small wooden Dutch dolls. "Saw them in the market at Caxley," she said, "and couldn't resist them, Mary. They reminded me of a family of Dutch dolls I had at their age. They can amuse themselves dressing them up." The dolls were tucked in at the top, their shiny black heads and stiff wooden arms sticking out attractively. The 2 women gazed at their handiwork with satisfaction. "Well, that's that," said Mrs. Barry. "I'm just going to clear away this tray and tidy up in the kitchen, and I shan't be long out of bed." "I'll wait till I'm sure those 2 scallywags are really asleep," answered Mary. "I wouldn't put it past our Jane to pretend, you know. She's stubborn when she wants to be, and she's real set on finding out who brings the presents." The hands of the clock on the mantelpiece stood at 10 o'clock. How the evening had flown. Mary tidied the table, listening to the gale outside and the sound of her mother singing in the kitchen. She suddenly remembered her own small presents upstairs, still unwrapped, and crept aloft to fetch them. The door of the girls' room was ajar. She tiptoed in and looked down upon the sleeping pair. It seemed impossible that either of them could be feigning sleep, so rhythmically were they breathing. What angels they looked. She made her way downstairs and swiftly wrapped up the necklaces and handkerchiefs. The very last, she thought thankfully, just a tag for Mum's cyclamen, and I can write that and tie it on when I go to bed. She selected the prettiest tag she could find and slipped it into her skirt pocket to take upstairs. Mrs. Barry reappeared carrying the glass of water that she took to her bedroom every night. "I'll be off then, my dear. Don't stay up too long. You must be tired." She bent to kiss her daughter. "The girls have gone off, I think, but I'll give them another 10 minutes to make sure." "See you in the morning then, Mary," said the old lady, mounting the stairs. Mary raked the hot ashes from the fire and swept up the hearth. She fetched the 2 bulging pillowcases and put the stockings on top of them. Then she sat in the old armchair and let exhaustion flood through her. "Bone tired," she confessed to herself, "bone tired." Above her, she could hear the creaking of the floorboards as her mother moved about, and then a cry and hasty footsteps coming down the stairs. The door flew open, and Mrs. Barry, clad in her flannel nightgown, stood wild-eyed on the threshold. "Mum, what's the matter?" cried Mary, starting to her feet. "A mouse!" gasped Mrs. Barry, shuddering uncontrollably. "There's a mouse in my bedroom!" The 2 women gazed at each other, horror-struck. Mary's heart sank rapidly, but she spoke decisively. "Here, you come by the fire and let's shut that door. The girls will be waking up." She pushed up the armchair she had just vacated, and Mrs. Barry, still shuddering, sat down thankfully. "You'll catch your death," said Mary, raking a few bright embers together and dropping one or two shreds of dry bark from the hearth onto the dying fire. "You ought to put your dressing gown on." "I'm not going to fetch it," she stated Mrs. Barry flatly. "I know I'm a fool, but I just can't abide mice." "I'll fetch it," said Mary, "and I'll set the mouse trap, too, while I'm there. Where did it go?" Mrs. Barry shivered afresh. "It ran under the bed, horrible little thing. You should have seen its tail, Mary, a good 3 inches long. It made me cry out, seeing it skedaddle like that." "I heard you," said Mary, making for the kitchen to get the mouse trap. Mrs. Barry drew nearer to the fire, tucking her voluminous nightgown round her bare legs. A cruel draught whistled in from the passage, but nothing would draw her from the safety of the armchair. Who knows how many more mice might be at large on a night like this? Mary, her mouth set in a determined line, reappeared with the mousetrap and went quietly upstairs. She returned in a moment, carrying her mother's dressing gown and slippers. "Now you wrap up," she said coaxingly, as if she were addressing one of her little daughters. "We'll soon catch that old mouse for you." "I'm ashamed to be so afeard of a little creature," confessed Mrs. Barry, "but there it is. They give me the horrors, mice do, and rats even worse. Don't ask me why." Mary knew from experience this terror of her mother's. She confronted other hazards of country life with calm courage. Spiders, caterpillars, bulls in fields, adders on the heath, any animal in pain or fury found old Mrs. Barry completely undaunted. Mary could remember her mother dealing with a dog that had been run over and writhed, demented with pain, not far from their cottage door. It had savaged 2 would-be helpers, and a few distressed onlookers were wondering what to do next when Mrs. Barry approached and calmed the animal in a way that had seemed miraculous. But a mouse sent her flying, and Mary knew, as she found some wood to replenish the fire, that nothing would persuade her mother back to the bedroom until the intruder had been dispatched. She settled herself in the other armchair, resigned to another 20 minutes or more of waiting. She longed desperately for her bed, but could not relax until her mother was comfortably settled. She listened for sounds from above, the click of the mousetrap that would release her from her vigil, or the noise of the children waking and rummaging for the pillowcases, wailing at the non-appearance of Father Christmas. But above the noise of the storm outside, it was difficult to hear anything clearly upstairs. She pushed the 2 telltale pillowcases under the table so that they were hidden from the eyes of any child who might enter unannounced, and leaned back with her eyes closed. Invariably, Bertie's dear face drifted before her when she closed her eyes, but now, to her surprise and shame, another man's face smiled at her. It was the face of one of Bertie's workmates. He, too, had been one of the party on the tragic Wazegoose and had written to Mary and her mother soon after the accident. She had known him from childhood. Rather a milksop, most people said of Ray Bullen, but Mary liked his gentle ways and thought none the less of him because he had remained a bachelor. "Some are the marrying sort and some aren't," she had replied once to the village gossip who had been speculating upon Ray's future. Mary was all too conscious of the desire of busybodies to find her a husband in the months after Bertie's death. They got short shrift from Mary, and interest waned before long. "Too sharp-tongued by half," said those who had been lashed by it. "No man in his senses would take her on, and them 2 girls." Here they were wrong. 1 or 2 men had paid attention to Mary and would have welcomed some advances on her side, but none were forthcoming. Truth to tell, Mary was in such a state of numbed shock for so long that very little affected her. But Ray's letter of condolence had been kept. There was something unusually warm and comforting in the simple words. Here was true sympathy. It was the only letter that had caused Mary to weep, and, weeping, to find relief. She saw Ray very seldom, for their ways did not cross, but that afternoon in Caxley he had been at the bus stop when she arrived laden with baskets and anxious about the little girls amid the Christmas traffic. He had taken charge of them all so easily and naturally, seeing them onto the bus, disposing of the parcels, smiling at the children, and wishing them all well at Christmas, that it was not until she was halfway to Shepherd's Cross that Mary realized that she had somehow contrived to give the little girls a shilling each. He had somehow contrived to give the little girls a shilling each. Also, she realized with a pang, he must have missed his own bus, which went out about the same time as theirs. And we'll hear more about Mary and her thoughts about Ray and the thoughts about the mouse upstairs next time.